The House will be in order. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, the Chair will postpone further proceedings today on motions to suspend the rules on which a recorded vote or the yeas and nays are ordered, or votes objected to under the Clause 6 of Rule 20. The House will resume proceedings on postponed questions at a later time. For what purpose does the gentleman from the great state of Kentucky seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 1515.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 1515, a bill to increase access to agency guidance documents.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Comer, and the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, each will control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Kentucky.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on this measure.
Without objection.
I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 1515, the Guidance Out of Darkness Act or the GOOD Act. Regulatory guidance includes agency statements that, while not intended to have the force and effect of law, establish agency policies on statutory, regulatory, or technical issues. Because such guidance communicates how an agency will administer the law and its programs, it has a significant effect on regulated entities. Regulated entities and the public should know what agency guidance says about the laws and programs that affect them. However, guidance documents are not easy to find. They are not consistently posted on agency websites. This inconsistency burdens regulated entities, and it especially burdens small businesses, who often lack the resources to hire compliance experts. The problem is so bad that agency guidance documents are known as regulatory dark matter. For a brief time, the first Trump administration was able to bring helpful and needed sunshine to this situation. Following the GOOD Act's passage by the House during the 115th Congress, the first Trump administration voluntarily adopted the bill's reforms through an October 2019 executive order after the Senate failed to act. Under the executive order, guidance was required to become fully transparent online. Across the government, each agency was directed to make available on its website a single searchable index database with links to all guidance documents in effect. As a result, for the first time, members of the public could easily find whatever agency guidance they needed online in a central location. The order was in effect during 2019 and 2020, but was regrettably rescinded by the Biden administration. As a result, agencies pulled down their guidance web pages, and guidance once again fell into darkness, increasing the potential for agency abuse. This is why we need to, once again, pass the GOOD Act in the House and require agencies to publish their regulatory guidance in a single, easily accessible location. The American public deserves nothing less from their government. I want to thank my committee colleague, Representative Ro Khanna from California, for co-sponsoring my legislation. And I especially want to thank the ranking member for working with my staff to help us advance a bipartisan bill here today. I urge my colleagues to support this simple and necessary transparency bill. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
I rise in support of H.R. 1515, the Guidance Out of Darkness Act, sponsored by our chairman, Mr. Comer of Kentucky. My Republican colleagues like to say that this bill will cast a light on what they love to call regulatory dark matter. This melodramatic term refers to the guidance documents federal agencies issue to help the public better understand actions and policies. Guidance documents come in the form of interpretive rules, which describe an agency's interpretation of a statute or regulation and general statements of agency policy. For example, an agency might issue a guidance document to clarify a regulation and its technical details or to offer more information on compliance. Guidance documents don't have the force of law and are already publicly available. The bill simply requires agencies to publish guidance documents on a dedicated website for ease of access. It also requires the Director of the Office of Management Budget to designate a single website for accessing all agency guidance documents except for those exempt from disclosure under the FOIA. Democrats support the transparent federal government that is always accountable to the public, so we support this bill as well. We don't buy into the incendiary rhetoric of some MAGA Republicans trying to paint agency guidance documents as some kind of sinister tool of the administrative state. They are the very opposite. My Republican colleagues have said this bill is important because it restores elements of President Trump's Executive Order 13891 that was revoked by President Biden. To set the record straight, President Biden replaced that executive order, didn't revoke it, because it sought to limit the federal government's ability to address the country's challenges and serve its people. Instead, President Biden launched an important effort to modernize the regulatory review process, including the process around guidance documents, which we're addressing today. Let's be very clear. Republicans are dead set in rolling back the ability of federal agencies to protect the public from corporate bad actors. In contrast, Democrats are putting people before profits, including through evidence-based regulations that protect Americans' freedoms and well-being. Passage of this bill today is a good step in the right direction, as long as we all actually are interested in regulatory transparency and accountability. I urge my colleagues to support the bill, and I'm happy to join them. I reserve the balance of our time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Kiley.
The gentleman is recognized from California.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The basic premise of this bill, which I am happy to co-sponsor, is that we should not have secret laws in the United States. A major opportunity that we have right now is to modernize our government and to rein in the inexorable growth of the administrative state, restoring power to our elected representatives, to states, to local communities, to the American people themselves. And when we think about the administrative state, we think about all the regulations that are churned out one after another and compiled in the ever-growing Federal Register. But the reality is that is just the tip of the iceberg. Layered on top of all of that are these so-called guidance documents. This is memos, dear colleague members, letters, bulletins, all manner of what is referred to as regulatory dark matter. And with respect to the ranking member, this is not a melodramatic term. It's actually quite appropriate. In physics, dark matter refers to the mysterious substance that makes up about 85% of the mass of the universe, but no one really knows what it is. And similarly, all of these guidance documents make up a great deal of the regulatory activity in our country, and yet the agencies themselves can't even manage to track them down, let alone how is an individual or a small business supposed to find out what this particular interpretation of the law is and how it will affect them, let alone how is Congress supposed to figure out how the laws that we have passed are ultimately being enforced and administered. So this is a common sense measure that says that all of these documents, these guidance documents that have real teeth when it comes to the enforcement of regulations, need to be compiled in one place that is searchable and accessible to every American citizen. It's a positive step for transparency and towards restoring government by the people. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
We reserve, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman from Virginia reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I have no further speakers and am prepared to close.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I also have no further speakers, and I urge passage of H.R. 1515 and yield back the balance of our time.
The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I urge my colleagues to support the Guidance Out of Darkness or Good Act and to pass this legislation once again like the House did last term. I yield back the balance of my time.
The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 1515? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, The rules are suspended. The bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. For what purpose does the gentleman from Kentucky seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 872 as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 872, a bill to require covered contractors implement a vulnerability disclosure policy consistent with NIST guidelines and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Comer, and the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Kentucky.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on this measure.
Without objection.
I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm happy to support H.R. 872, the Federal Contractor Cybersecurity Vulnerability Reduction Act. This bill will require federal contractors to have a vulnerability disclosure policy, or VDP. This would help contractors more quickly alert federal agencies about vulnerabilities, which could avoid a future cybersecurity breach. Federal agencies must act quickly when dealing with a cyber attack. The sooner a federal agency knows it may have a problem, the sooner it can take steps to protect its systems and data, including the personal data of millions of Americans. It is reasonable to require federal contractors to play a proactive role in addressing vulnerabilities in federal information systems. This bill complements the committee's ongoing work aimed at helping federal agencies protect their data and information systems. I want to thank our great subcommittee chairwoman, Nancy Mace, for introducing this important legislation, which the House Oversight Committee unanimously passed last year and the House later passed as part of the fiscal year 2025 National Defense Authorization Act. I also want to thank Subcommittee Ranking Member Brown for co-sponsoring this legislation, building on the bipartisan support from last year. I encourage my colleagues to once again support H.R. 872, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
I appreciate today's consideration of the Federal Contractor Cybersecurity Vulnerability Reduction Act, as well as the work of Chairwoman Mace and Ranking Member Brown in leading this legislation to us today. The bill would ensure that federal contractors implement vulnerability disclosure policies consistent with the guidance and guidelines of the National Institute of Standards and Technology, industry best practices, and international standards. Each year, software developers, security researchers, and others discover tens of thousands of security vulnerabilities in computer software and systems. For example, in 2023 alone, more than 29,000 common vulnerabilities and exposures were logged in this widely used National Vulnerability Database. If companies establish a process for accepting, assessing, and managing reports of such vulnerabilities, otherwise known as vulnerability disclosure policies, they can make use of such discoveries to fix problems before they're exploited by malign actors. Vulnerability disclosure policies are an extremely effective tool. Most federal agencies already have such policies, as do federal contractors and subcontractors, providing information systems and Internet of Things devices to federal agencies. By requiring all federal contractors to follow suit, this bill shores up another front in the never-ending battle to protect the federal government's information systems and data, and thereby the American public. Thank you. I urge passage of the bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserved. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 10 minutes to the gentlewoman from South Carolina, the chairman of the Cybersecurity Subcommittee, Ms. Mace.
The gentlewoman from South Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to thank my friend, the distinguished chairman of the Committee of Oversight and Government Reform, Chairman Comer, for yielding. I want to thank the ranking member, Mr. Connolly, as well, both of you for your leadership on this critical issue, not only in this congressional session, but the last one as well. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in strong support of my bill, H.R. 872, the Federal Contractor Cybersecurity Vulnerability Reduction Act. In 2020, the Office of Management and Budget directed federal agencies to implement cybersecurity vulnerability disclosures policies. These policies enable third-party researchers and white hat hackers to work with the federal government to proactively identify and patch vulnerabilities in information systems before a cyber attack takes place. And we all know how critically important it is, particularly with systems that are older than some of us in this room, that these vulnerability disclosure policies require these third parties to notify the federal agency of any sensitive data they encounter, like personally identifiable information, financial information, proprietary information, or trade secrets. This allows a cybersecurity vulnerability to be addressed and data to be secured before it is exploited by malign actors, including our adversaries. And we know countries or malign actors affiliated with China, Russia, Iran, and others are after us all day, every day, 365 days a year. These vulnerability disclosure policies are critical to preventing cyber attacks on federal systems. This was an important step in federal cybersecurity, but the work of federal agencies is supplemented by millions of contractors working on behalf of federal departments and agencies. The federal government awards over 11 million contracts annually, with many of those contractors having access to federal systems and vast amounts of sensitive information, including personally identifiable information of American citizens. My bill, the Federal Contractor Cybersecurity Vulnerability Reduction Act, will require the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, to oversee updates to the Federal Acquisition Regulation to ensure federal contractors with access to federal systems or work with federal data adopt these vulnerability disclosure policies as well. My bill also requires the Secretary of Defense to update the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation supplement to require the same cybersecurity vulnerability disclosure policies, safeguarding the personal information of our service members and the information vital to our national security. These updates shall be done consistent with the guidelines and best practices developed by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and simply require contractors to abide by the same cybersecurity standards as federal agencies. Federal contractors with access to government systems and data should have the same safeguards in place as the government itself, ensuring federal systems and data are protected and security vulnerabilities are addressed. Adoption of vulnerability disclosure policies by government contractors will help protect the sensitive data of American citizens and our national security. My bill would close a crucial vulnerability and protect our nation from malicious actors who seek to steal our data and harm our citizens. I'm very pleased to see this bill pass out of the Oversight Committee unanimously last year by a vote of 42-0. But it's long past time we get this done until these vulnerability disclosure policies are adopted across the entire federal digital ecosystem. Our nation's data and security is at risk. Before I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I will before I yield back, I want to say I walked into the chamber this afternoon moments ago, and I saw a tweet or a post on X from South Carolina Attorney General Alan Wilson, who said he's protecting South Carolinians from sexual predators is a top priority. Protecting citizens of this country has been my top priority since the day I was ever sworn into office, particularly my constituents whom I represent. I recently gave a speech on this floor where I was very detailed about horrific abuses I've experienced. When you talk about vulnerabilities, I know about being vulnerable. When you talk about cybersecurity, I sit awake in my bed every single night wondering if anyone has ever seen those videos of me or any of the other women in the tapes that I outlined in my speech. And my Attorney General in the last 3 weeks since I came forward and gave that speech on the floor, my Attorney General, Alan Wilson, and I'm going to make sure every South Carolinian knows your name forever, not just for what you did, but what for you have not done, your inaction on vulnerabilities of my own constituents in my district in South Carolina, because you've done nothing in the last 3 weeks except for attack me, a member of Congress who did my duty to protect her constituents. I will keep fighting for every American citizen, whether it is in this bill about vulnerability disclosure policy in federal government. I will do it for rape victims, not just in my district, in my state, in my country. I will do it because I care, and I swore an oath to the Constitution to serve my constituents, to serve my state, and to serve my nation in every possible way that we can. So I urge my colleagues to take cyber threats by malign actors seriously. I urge my colleagues to protect the security of Americans' data. I urge my colleagues to do whatever we can in this chamber to protect people who are vulnerable, whether we're talking about data or we're talking about rape victims, sex trafficking, all those things. Victims should not be attacked, ever. And I'm one of those victims. I'm tired of being attacked by the Attorney General. I'm tired of being blamed for being a rape victim and being a victim of peeping toms and voyeurism. Same with these other victims. I'm tired of it. And I will not stand for it. Not in this chamber, not in my state, and not back home. So Attorney General Alan Wilson, I hope you have your number 2 pencil out, and I hope you're taking notes, and I hope that pencil is sharpened, because once I get my teeth stuck in you, I am not letting go. And I will fight for every woman and girl across this country, all day, every day, always. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
Members are reminded to address their remarks to the chair. The gentlelady from South Carolina yields. The gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
We reserve the balance of our time, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman from Virginia reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
I have no further speakers and am prepared to close.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
I support H.R. 872 and urge its adoption, and I yield back the balance of our time.
The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I urge my colleagues to support this important legislation, which will streamline cybersecurity, vulnerability disclosure to protect federal IT systems. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 872 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. For what purpose does the gentleman from Kentucky seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 856.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 856, a bill to require the Director of the Office of Management and Budget conduct a review to determine the impact of the lowest price, technically acceptable source selection process on national security and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Comer, and the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, will each control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Kentucky.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on this measure.
Without objection.
I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The lowest price technically acceptable, LPTA, is a source selection method outlined in the Federal Acquisition Regulation. This process uses price as a determining factor for a contract rather than other technical or operational factors. Following legislative work done by the House Oversight Committee during the 115th Congress, constraints were placed on agency use of LPTA in the fiscal year 2019 National Defense Authorization Act. These constraints recognize that LPTA criteria are not always appropriate for agencies seeking complex or technically innovative services. For instance, this can result in agencies sacrificing long-term value for short-term savings. We also do not want LPTA to be used in a manner that jeopardizes national security. This bill requires the Director of the Office of Management and Budget to evaluate this source selection process to determine whether agencies are using LPTA in an appropriate manner. I thank my Oversight Committee colleague, Mr. Donalds, for his leadership on this bill. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
I rise in strong support of the Safe and Smart Federal Purchasing Act, of which I'm a proud co-sponsor. The bill would require the Director of the Office of Management and Budget to review the procurement management practices of federal agencies to determine whether the use of acquisition procedures focused exclusively on cost, known as the lowest price technically acceptable, pose any national security risk. Since our committee reported this bill last Congress, I appreciate that the majority sought and incorporated feedback from the administration. When federal agencies purchase goods and services, they aim to achieve the best value for the American people. In the words of the Federal Acquisition Regulation, best value means that the acquisition should provide, quote, the greatest overall benefit in response to the requirement, unquote. Under LPTA procedures, price is the determining factor in awarding a contract, with no consideration given to other factors. This contrasts with the more frequently used trade-off approach, which looks at the bigger picture and considers additional factors beyond just cost, perhaps assessing elements like quality and performance or a bidder's technical or managerial expertise. This bill and the trade-off approach to federal contracting understand that the focusing on contract price alone can actually increase the overall cost to the federal government and the American people. For example, cutting costs in the short term can lead to expensive project delays, might result in taxpayer dollars flowing to adversarial nations that threaten U.S. security interests. If no consideration is given to the strength and integrity of the bidder's supply chain, cutting costs in the short term could lead to inferior products, disastrous supply shortages at critical moments. I believe this is a thoughtful, common sense approach to contracting. I urge my colleagues to support the bill, and I reserve the balance of our time.
The gentleman from Virginia reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 5 minutes to the gentleman and rising star from the state of Florida, Mr. Donalds.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd be remiss without thanking Chairman Comer. Chairman, I might have to ask you to introduce me everywhere going forward. I greatly appreciate that. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank you for this time on the floor today, and I rise in strong support of my bill, the Safe and Smart Federal Purchasing Act. For background, lowest price technically acceptable is the source selection method outlined in the Federal Acquisition Regulation, or FAR. Simply put, LPTA standard prioritizes price above everything else. Focusing on price instead of other technical or operational factors in federal procurement can result in agencies cutting corners, long-term value being sacrificed, or in its worst aspects, even potential risk to America's national security. In my view, the use of LPTA may not always be appropriate when federal agencies purchase innovative technologies and technical services, and agencies should have the flexibility to pay more for a superior solution if the circumstances are appropriate. And I would say to the American people, obviously, with all of the things that we were talking about in Washington around the Department of Governmental Efficiency, better known as DOGE, going through and trying to cut costs, we do have to be mindful that we're getting the best products for the federal government to use, because that actually does yield great results for the American people. Moreover, we as Congress have an obligation to fully understand the impacts of utilizing LPTA. One example of when LPTA may not be appropriate relates to the procurement of Chinese drones. Chinese drone maker DJI is the world's largest manufacturer of personal and professional drones, and federal agencies to this day utilize DJI drones, which present a large national security risk. But why would federal agencies procure Chinese drones when there are higher quality American drones currently available on the market? That's when the lowest price, technically acceptable FAR standard may come into play. To provide some additional context, Chinese state-backed DJI aggressively dropped its prices in 2015. And now DJI drones account for more than 75% of the global drone marketplace, offering its products in over 100 countries. While a wide range of innovative American drones products are available, in many cases, LPTA slides the federal procurement preference scale away from American drones in favor of these Chinese drones merely because they're cheaper. But to emphasize, all companies in China are required by Chinese law to give the Communist Chinese Party access to all their information upon request. In fact, in August of 2017, Homeland Security Investigations issued an intelligence bulletin warning that DJI was providing critical infrastructure and law enforcement data to the Chinese government. Today, lowest price technically acceptable does not account for national security implications. So my bill would simply require an evaluation of potential national security concerns associated with the LPTA FAR standard. Instead of just looking at the initial price tag and procuring the cheapest product and service, it is vitally important that the United States government understand the national security implications associated with its federal procurement policies. I want to thank the ranking member, Mr. Connolly, for co-leading this bipartisan initiative with me. I urge my colleagues to support this common sense piece of legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Florida yields back. The gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
We have no more speakers on this side and are prepared to close if the majority is.
The gentleman from Virginia reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
I have no further speakers and prepared to close.
The gentleman is recognized. Reserves. The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Once again, I believe this is a common sense approach to contracting. We can't just take a mindless approach to lowest cost winning every bid. It can jeopardize national security, and at the end of the day, it can actually cost more than if we had gone a different way. So I thank my friend from Florida for his leadership on this issue. I urge my colleagues to support passage of H.R. 856, and I yield back the balance of our time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Safe and Smart Federal Purchasing Act is measured and targeted legislation that can inform future congressional work on federal procurement, a policy area we know is ripe for reform and taxpayer savings. I encourage my House colleagues to support this common sense bipartisan bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 856? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative. The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from Kentucky seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 758.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 758, a bill to direct the United States Postal Service to issue regulations requiring Postal Service employees and contractors to report to the Postal Service traffic crashes involving vehicles carrying mail that result in injury or death and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Comer, and the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Kentucky.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on this measure.
Without objection.
I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of H.R. 758, which requires U.S. Postal Service employees and contractors to report traffic crashes that result in injury or death to the Postal Service. In 2023, the Wall Street Journal published an article alleging that the Postal Service contracted with low-cost trucking companies that did not follow highway safety regulations. They also reported that postal contractors have been involved in car crashes that have killed 79 people in the last 3 years. To conduct oversight of this important topic, Congress needs to be informed. The Mail Traffic Deaths Reporting Act requires the Postal Service to report to Congress any traffic crashes that result in injury or death. Under the bill, Postal Service employees and contractors will have 3 days to report a traffic accident to the Postal Service. These reports will include, at minimum, the date, time, location, nature of the crash, information identifying the contractor, and number of injuries and fatalities. The Postal Service will maintain a comprehensive internal digital database of this information. The Postal Service is also required to compile a publicly available report summarizing annual stats related to injuries and deaths from traffic accidents. I thank Representative Conley, the ranking member of the House Oversight Committee, for working to partner with me on this necessary legislation. I encourage all of my House colleagues to support this national safety legislation. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I will consume such time as I use this afternoon.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of the Mail Traffic Deaths Reporting Act, bipartisan legislation I'm proud to co-lead with our chairman, Mr. Comer. This common sense bill earned unanimous House approval in the 118th Congress, demonstrating our shared commitment to public safety. This legislation addresses a critical safety gap by requiring the U.S. Postal Service to collect, track, and report serious crashes and fatalities involving vehicles transporting the U.S. mail. After meeting with families of truck crash victims and hearing their painful, heartbreaking stories, we're resolute in our mission to prevent further avoidable tragedies. The need for this bill was tragically illustrated in June of 2022 when the Godines family was struck by a truck contracted by a Postal Service with faulty brakes, no insurance, and a driver without a commercial driver's license. 3 generations, Mr. Speaker, of that family, including a 3-month-old Tesla, lost their lives in one tragic incident. But this wasn't isolated. Between 2020 and 2023, at least 79 people were killed in crashes involving Postal Service contracted trucks, but the true number may be even higher because, shockingly, the Postal Service was failing to document these incidents. This lack of oversight has allowed alarming safety violations to persist. Between 2020 and 2022, the Department of Transportation identified 466 Postal Service trucking contractors with high rates of hours of service violations. For example, in 2021 and 2022, 39% of companies carrying U.S. mail repeatedly violated rules preventing driver exhaustion. One contractor violated these critical driver safety protocols more than 200 times over a 5-year period. Unfortunately, the Postal Service's original approach to fatality and safety data was out of sight, out of mind. In May of 2023, I requested the Postal Service Inspector General launch an audit of the Postal Service's contract trucking safety. As a result of the review, the Postal Service established an ad hoc reporting system, one that the Postal Service still has failed to share with our offices. However, the Postal Service still lacks formal written policies for tracking contractor accidents and fatalities, including guidance for terminating contractors or subcontractors who are non-compliant. Our bill codifies the Inspector General's primary recommendation and delivers accountability by requiring detailed reporting of any mail transport crash resulting in serious injury or death, maintenance of a comprehensive database of such reports, and annual public reporting of such findings. And most importantly, establish penalties for contractors who fail to comply with the reporting requirements. This is a long overdue bill that will save lives. I urge its passage and reserve the balance of our time.
Gentleman from Virginia reserves. From the gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I have no further speakers and am prepared to close.
The gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
I'm proud to have led this effort with Mr. Comer. This is going to save lives. I urge all of our colleagues to support the legislation of H.R. 758 and yield back the balance of our time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Postal Service is tasked with the challenging job of providing fast, reliable mail service nationwide. While they do so, their safety should be prioritized. I encourage all my colleagues to support this common sense bill that increases transparency into the Postal Service's safety record to improve the public safety throughout our nation. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill, H.R. 758? Those in favor say aye. Those in favor, those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair,
Mr. Speaker, I ask for the yeas and nays.
Pardon me. Yes, those if being affirmative, for what purpose, we both jumped the gun there a little bit. Does the gentleman rise? You want to
I asked for the
record it?
yeas and nays.
Yes. The yeas and nays are requested. All those in the favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed. Okay. For what purpose does the gentleman from Kansas seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass House Resolution 153.
The clerk will report the title of the resolution.
House Resolution 153, resolution expressing condolences to the families, friends, and loved ones of the victims of the crash of American Eagle Flight 5342 and PAT 25, and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Mann, and the gentlewoman from Kansas, Ms. Davids, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Kansas. The gentleman, I'm sorry about that. The gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Mann.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and insert extraneous material into the record on House Resolution 153.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of House Resolution 153, which expresses condolences to the families, friends, and loved ones of the victims of the crash of American Flight 5342 and PAT 25. This is a bipartisan resolution to honor the 67 lives that were lost during the tragic collision that occurred over the Potomac River on January 29, 2025. January 29th is typically a day of celebration in Kansas. From Manhattan to Goodland, Topeka to Liberal, Kansas City to Dodge City, Kansans come together to celebrate the rich history of Kansas and the anniversary of our statehood. January 29, 2025 changed the meaning of this day for Kansas and for the country forever. The world lost 67 bright, innocent lives that day, and I speak for all Americans when I say that this is the day that we will never, ever forget. When we celebrate Kansas Day in years to come, we will also feel the nudging of the somber emotions aroused by this tragic accident. We will remember our fellow Americans whose lives were tragically lost: farmers, parents, professors, college students with bright futures taken from us far too soon. For more than a century, the United States has led the world in aviation safety and innovation. Wichita has been known as the air capital of the world for more than a century due to our historic ties to the aviation history. Although tragic accidents like these are rare, none of us are strangers to the hazards involved in man's pursuit of flight. We must continue to strive to learn as much as we can about this accident so that it never, ever happens again. House Resolution 153 also allows the heroism displayed by the many local, state, and federal officials that sprang into action to perform recovery efforts. These men and women are heroes that demonstrate a tremendous respect for the fallen, working in cold temperatures and icy waters for several days. Mr. Speaker, I urge support of this legislation and reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentlewoman from Kansas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of HRES 153, expressing condolences to families, friends, and loved ones of the victims of the plane crash of American Eagle Flight 5342 and U.S. Army call sign PAT 25, and for other purposes introduced by my colleagues from Kansas, Representatives Ron Estes and Tracy Mann. I'd like to thank both Congressman Estes and Congressman Mann for their leadership on this matter, as well as the leadership and cooperation of the entire Kansas congressional delegation. The last couple of months have been heartbreaking and trying. It has been a hard time for our country and the U.S. aviation system. There have been numerous accidents, with the Potomac DCA mid-air collision being among the most tragic. At approximately 8:52 p.m. on January 29, 2025, American Airlines Flight 5342, flying from Wichita, Kansas to Ronald Reagan National Airport, collided with UH-60 Army Black Hawk helicopter PAT-25 while on final approach to runway 33 at DCA, resulting in both aircraft crashing over the Potomac River. There were no survivors. 67 innocent lives were lost, 60 passengers, 4 flight crew, and 3 Army soldiers. There's no one in my home state who hasn't been deeply affected by this tragedy. Kansas is known as the air capital of the world, a place where aviation is not just an industry but a way of life. The passengers on Flight 5342 were our neighbors, our coworkers, and our loved ones. We are forever grateful for the more than 300 first responders who arrived almost immediately on the scene to try to rescue survivors. Responding parties initially included Washington, D.C. Fire and Emergency Medical Services, the Metropolitan Police Department, Virginia State and Municipal Police Departments, and multiple federal agencies, including the NTSB, FBI, and U.S. Coast Guard. Sadly, this and other events stand as a stark reminder of the complexities of the national airspace system and that we shouldn't take the precious few moments with loved ones for granted. We must investigate this accident thoroughly to prevent this event from ever happening again and ensure that aviation safety always remains a top priority. With regard to the investigation, we are grateful to the NTSB personnel who are actively supporting the victims' families through the agency's Family Assistance Program. Family assistance is a critical function of the NTSB and invaluable to those mourning the loss of one or more of their loved ones. In times of tragedy, it can be difficult to sort through the torrent of emotions: sadness, rage, loneliness, and regret. And while counseling cannot bring back the loved ones lost, it can help survivors process the storm and maybe just a little bit blunt some of the pain. The NTSB is also leading the accident investigation itself. The agency deployed over 40 investigators alongside the Coast Guard, FBI, dive teams, and the Army Corps of Engineers to aid in the recovery and analysis. Aside from the wreckage of both aircraft and the personal effects of the victims, the agency has recovered the recording devices from both aircraft and are being analyzed by NTSB experts. This effort also extended far beyond the NTSB's personnel. Hundreds of government employees are supporting this investigative mission, including employees from the FAA, FBI, and Department of Transportation. As a member of Congress and as a citizen who cares deeply for U.S. aviation, I'm proud of those public servants and grateful for their sense of duty and sacrifice. Even though we all want answers, we must resist the urge to speculate on the causes of aviation accidents and allow the NTSB to complete its work. Aviation safety is dependent on a stable operating environment and technical analysis. And I, for one, would like to trust the experts as they continue their mission to make the skies safer. But when the final report comes out and the time comes to act, I hope that this body remembers this moment. We must do everything in our power, working across the aisle, to prevent this from ever happening again. In the meantime, let us come together in expressing our deepest condolences and pass this resolution. Our thoughts and prayers remain with the passengers, crew, their loved ones, and first responders. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlelady reserves. The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 5 minutes to my good friend, the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Estes.
Gentleman yields. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Representative Mann, for managing the floor time on this resolution. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of House Resolution 153, a resolution honoring the victims of Flight 5342 and Black Hawk PAT-25 and offering condolences to the families, friends, and loved ones. First, I want to offer my own condolences, my prayers and support to those who are mourning the loss of a loved one. While it's been a little more than a month since this tragic incident, there's still no words to adequately express the heartbreak we all feel at your loss, and no words that can properly console you. I pray that in time, God would give you and all those impacted a peace that would surpass all understanding. Just as we stand with those suffering now in their time of loss, we'll continue to stand with them as we continue to understand what happened on that tragic night of January 29th. I hope the answers that are uncovered will help bring some closure to those grieving and help ensure that a tragedy like this never happens again. As we honor the 67 lives cut short by this accident, I also want to thank the countless first responders who rushed to the scene to first try to rescue and then recover those aboard Flight 5342 and PAT 25. Thanks to their tireless and selfless efforts, the bodies of all 67 victims have been recovered. Additionally, I want to extend thanks to the staff at Wichita's Eisenhower Airport and to the greater Wichita community, where Flight 5342 originated, for their efforts to embrace and lift up those impacted by that crash. In towns and cities across the nation and the world, countless other communities have banded together to similarly show support to members of their community who lost a loved one on that tragic night. It is in each home, school, workplace, and community where each of the 67 victims was known and loved that they will continue to be remembered, celebrated, and honored. As we've learned more about the individual passengers aboard the plane, as well as the pilots and flight crew of Flight 5342 and the crew of the Black Hawk, we've come to know how they meant to the people around them and how much they will be missed. We commit to honoring their memory by doing the best we can to carry out a thorough investigation and make whatever changes are deemed necessary. I'm grateful to the National Transportation Safety Board, the FAA, the Army, and all the other involved agencies for the swift progress they've made thus far and for the work that they're committed to carrying out. I also extend my thanks to Transportation and Infrastructure Chairman Sam Graves for his help in bringing this resolution to the floor and to all the members who've offered their support during this time. The devastating plane crash coincided with Kansas Day, a day our state was founded 164 years ago. It's typically a day of recognizing the state's heritage and when school children across the state learn Kansas facts and symbols. But beyond the sunflower, western meadowlark, and the home on the range, our state is known for something else not found in a textbook or school worksheet: our compassion and care for one another. Kansas is a special place to call home, and after a tragedy like what happened on January 29th, we not only grieve with the family and friends we know, but we grieve for all of those who lost their lives that evening. More than a month's passed since the events of January 29th, but that is a date that will be forever etched in the minds and hearts of the American people. As their representatives in Congress and the representative of the air capital of the world, we come together today to offer our sincerest condolences to each person who is grieving the loss of a loved one and to honor the victims of Flight 5342 and PAT 25. May they rest in peace. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman from Kansas reserves. The gentlewoman from Kansas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to yield 3 minutes to Congressman Beyer.
Gentleman's recognized. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, I want to add my thanks, my condolences, and the very real grief of my constituents and neighbors to what's already been said. We're here today to honor the lives lost on American Eagle Flight 5342 and the brave souls aboard the PAT 25 helicopter. Each of them was more than a passenger, more than a soldier. They were loved ones, friends, parents, classmates, children, teammates, and colleagues whose very presence made the world better. And while the flight manifest has not been shared, from the names that have been shared publicly, I want to specifically mention those who lived in the 8th District of Northern Virginia: Vikesh Patel, Staff Sergeant Ryan O'Hara, Alessia Taylor and her daughter Olivia Terr, Yu Zhou Zhao, Kyan Mao and their son Eddie Zhao, and members of the Hanos family, Stephanie, Roger, and their son Corey. We take time to remember them today. I express my deep condolences to their family. I reiterate my heartfelt thanks to the first responders supporting this effort. They heard the call and they rushed out immediately, risking their lives in the deadly cold and the icy water of the Potomac as part of the rescue operations. These include the best of Virginia's 8th, the fire departments, emergency management teams, police departments of the City of Alexandria, Arlington County, Fairfax County, the City of Falls Church, the Metropolitan Washington Airports Authority, and of the Commonwealth of Virginia. I'd also like to recognize the federal agencies working on the recovery and investigation, including the National Transportation Safety Board, the FBI, the Federal Aviation Administration, the Coast Guard, the Army, and all the others who've contributed. I want to thank those from local jurisdictions, hospitals, mental health providers, even caring neighbors and support services who offered on-the-scene support to our emergency responders and who continue to support those impacted. Mr. Speaker, mental health is critically important. I want to stress how many people have been impacted by this tragedy and connect folks to resources to help. And finally, I want to thank all the air traffic controllers, the MO employees, and the DCA employees who have returned to their jobs and worked tirelessly to keep our airspace safe. I know it's got to be incredibly difficult working in close proximity to this tragedy, seeing the recovery efforts while completing your jobs. And my heart goes out to you, and thank you for your professionalism in this trying time. Mr. Speaker, in sorrow and shared humanity, I wholeheartedly support this resolution, and I yield back.
Gentlewoman from Kansas suspends. The gentleman from Kansas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Babin.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you to my good friend who is holding this session in such a great and worthy cause. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in solemn remembrance of the lives lost and the tragic crashes of American Eagle Flight 5342 and PAT 25. To the families, friends, and loved ones of the 67 victims, we offer our very deepest condolences. No words can ever ease the pain of such a devastating loss, but we stand with them, and we stand with every one of these folks in mourning and in the pursuit of answers in this tragic accident. This tragedy demands a full and thorough investigation to ensure that no family endures this kind of heartbreak again. The safety of our skies and the trust of the American people depend on accountability, transparency, and action. Let us honor the memory of those we lost by ensuring that such a catastrophe never happens again. I urge my colleagues to support this resolution, HRES 153, and I want to thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Kansas suspends. The gentlewoman from Kansas is recognized.
Thank you. I'd like to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Subramaniam.
The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my colleague from Kansas for yielding. On January 29th, our community in Northern Virginia was shattered. 67 lives were taken from us far too soon when American Eagle Flight 5342 and Army Flight Call Sign PAT-25 collided. And many of those on Flight 5342 called Virginia's 10th District home. And they leave behind countless family members, friends, and loved ones in our community. I am especially heartbroken for the children who were on the plane. Some of them were former Loudoun County public school students and members of our local figure skating community at the Ashburn Ice House and the Ion Center. Places where I'd taken my own daughters figure skating in the past. And to the service members who lost their lives on PT-25, thank you for your service to our nation. To the first responders who rushed to the scene and worked in frigid and dangerous conditions to save anyone they could, including Fairfax and Prince William County first responders, we are so grateful. And to the professionals at the NTSB who are investigating this tragedy to ensure we learn from it and to prevent others like it, you have our appreciation and full support in your work. And finally, to my constituents, we will do anything and everything we can to make sure a tragedy like this doesn't happen again. It will take a long time to come to terms with this loss, but I know that our community is resilient, and it has warmed my heart to see how it came together in the aftermath of such an awful tragedy for us. So I urge all of my colleagues to support this resolution, and I yield back.
The gentlewoman from Kansas suspends. The gentleman from Kansas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I have no more speakers, and I'm prepared to close. I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlewoman from Kansas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Once again, I would just urge all of my colleagues to support HRES 153 and continue to express condolences for all of the victims, their families, friends, and loved ones. And I yield back the balance of my time.
General yields. Gentleman from Kansas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman recognized.
Mr. Speaker, there's still a lot to uncover about this accident, and we are confident that the NTSB is reviewing the evidence so that we can learn from this accident to prevent future loss of life. As we express our deepest condolences and prayers, we join our beloved Kansas and nation in mourning the lives lost. Psalm 34:18 reminds us, the Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. We lift up the loved ones of the 67 lost souls and rest in the knowledge that no matter the circumstances we are facing, God is always with us. Kansas is the heartbeat of the country, and our state motto reminds us that we will persevere together through this difficult time. By adopting this measure, we honor the memory of these victims and ensure that they will never be forgotten. Mr. Speaker, I urge support of this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and agree to House Resolution 153? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the resolution is agreed to, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Pursuant to Clause 12A of Rule 1, the chair declares the House in recess until approximately 6:30 p.m. today.